What would you do if your neighbor started leaving parking tickets on your car for parking on a public street? Imagine you're just trying to drop your kids off at school, and suddenly, you find a note on your windshield accusing you of parking illegally, on a street you've used every day for years. That's exactly what happened to the parents in a quiet suburban neighborhood when one woman, Karen, decided she had the right to control the streets in front of her house. The parking area outside the school was never quite enough to accommodate all the parents rushing to get their kids to class, but it was public space, open to everyone. Or so they thought. Karen, who lived just a few houses down from the school, saw things differently. To her, the space in front of her home was her personal property, and she wasn't afraid to make it clear. As soon as a few cars started parking along the curb, out of necessity, since all the designated school spots were taken, Karen took matters into her own hands. She wasn't just annoyed, she was furious. She marched out of her front door, hands on her hips, an expression of righteous anger twisting her face. Without hesitation, she approached the first car parked along the street and slapped a note on the windshield. "You are parked illegally on my private property. Consider this a warning," it read. Her words weren't just harsh, they were absurd. As the parents walked away, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind them, the note sat there, the threat hanging in the air. It was an odd kind of power play, one that didn't make sense. How could she claim a public street as her own? How could anyone? Yet, Karen was convinced. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was the self-appointed ruler of her block, and she intended to make everyone around her understand that. What started as a simple misunderstanding over parking was quickly turning into something much more significant. The parents hadn't seen the worst of it yet, but soon, they would. As Karen continued her crusade, the parents couldn't believe what was happening. The first few fines were brushed off as an oddity, a one-off mistake, but soon enough, it became clear that Karen wasn't backing down. Every day, without fail, there were more notes, more accusations of illegal parking, and more arguments as parents tried to reason with her. The neighborhood, once peaceful and calm, was now a hotbed of tension. What was once a simple act of dropping off kids had turned into a battleground for Karen's increasingly bizarre claim of ownership over public property. The parents, frustrated and confused, began to talk among themselves, sharing stories of Karen's escalating behavior. Rachel, a mother whose child had a disability, shared an experience that pushed the situation to its breaking point. One day, after a particularly harrowing doctor's appointment, Rachel had parked in front of Karen's house because there were no other spaces. She was only there for a few minutes, but when she came back to her car, she found a note on the windshield. "You have no right to park here," it said, in the same scrawling, self-righteous handwriting. Rachel, stunned, tried to explain her situation to Karen, but Karen, unmoved, simply replied, "Your child's condition doesn't make you special. Rules are rules." The audacity of that comment sent a shockwave through the neighborhood. The parents had been dealing with Karen's antics for a while, but this was different. It wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about how she was willing to hurt people, to make them feel less than, just to maintain her control. The community had been growing increasingly divided as Karen's behavior became more erratic. But it wasn't until Mike, another parent, found himself the target of Karen's wrath that things really began to spiral out of control. One morning, Mike parked in front of Karen's house while dropping his kids off at school, only to return and find a note accusing him of damaging her property. The claim was completely baseless. There was no damage to Karen's property, but that didn't matter. She had decided that Mike, like the others, was an obstacle to her vision of control. The tension was palpable now, and something had to give. In the midst of the chaos, Karen's manipulation began to surface more clearly. She wasn't just enforcing her own rules on the street, she was also secretly working behind the scenes to gain leverage. Karen had been in contact with a local business owner, Greg, and had convinced him to back her up in exchange for favors. It turned out that Karen had been using her supposed authority over the parking situation to push for stricter rules, all while receiving perks and discounts from the business. The parents, already frustrated with Karen's behavior, were now faced with the realization that Karen wasn't just acting out of some misguided sense of righteousness, she was actively scheming to profit from the chaos she had created. This new revelation stoked the fire in the parents. They began to share their stories of how Karen had tried to control other aspects of the neighborhood, from demanding delivery drivers move their trucks away from her house to dictating where children could and couldn't play. The more the parents discussed, the clearer it became: Karen was a bully who thought she could manipulate everyone around her for her own benefit. The tipping point came when a few parents decided enough was enough. They gathered their evidence and filed complaints with the local authorities, hoping that this time, someone would take their claim seriously. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The parents were united now, with a common purpose. They had endured Karen's antics for months, but they had reached the point where they wouldn't let her push them around anymore. The fight for basic respect and fairness had turned into something larger, a fight for the neighborhood's soul. The authorities promised to investigate, but even as they waited for a resolution, the tension in the neighborhood grew thicker. The parents knew that Karen wasn't going to back down easily, and that the real battle was just beginning. But they also knew one thing: they had strength in numbers, and they weren't going to let Karen take that from them. The legal action against Karen marked a turning point in the battle. As the parents waited for the authorities to take action, Karen's behavior became even more erratic. She seemed to believe that the laws didn't apply to her, that she could continue issuing fines and bullying the neighborhood into submission. But the parents, now more united than ever, were determined to stop her. The neighborhood was buzzing with conversations about what steps to take next. The parents had finally decided to fight back, and it wasn't just about parking anymore, it was about standing up to someone who thought they could control everything. Karen, however, wasn't backing down. When she heard that the authorities were investigating, she went into full defense mode. She started posting flyers around the neighborhood, warning everyone to stay away from her private property. Her words were bold and filled with a sense of entitlement that was both infuriating and bizarre. She couldn't grasp the fact that she had no claim to the street, no legal right to control it, and yet, there she was, acting as though she was above the law. Her arrogance seemed to know no bounds. But her attempt to manipulate the situation only made things worse. She started rallying support from a few of the local businesses, trying to turn them against the parents who had spoken out. Greg, the business owner who had previously been helping her, continued to offer her backing, but even he seemed unsure about the legality of her actions. The neighborhood had begun to see through her manipulations. Karen wasn't just a neighbor with a misplaced sense of control, she was a bully using every tool at her disposal to further her own agenda. As the investigation proceeded, the authorities began to look more closely at Karen's actions. The more they dug into her claims, the more ridiculous they became. Karen's accusations that she owned the street were proven to be false. The area where she had been issuing fines was, in fact, public property, land that belonged to the city, not her. Her claim of ownership had been based on nothing but delusion, and the authorities quickly made it clear that she had no legal standing to impose any rules on the area. But Karen's pride wasn't so easily shattered. Even though the law was on the side of the parents, Karen refused to accept the truth. She doubled down, insisting that she had been right all along and that the authorities simply didn't understand her vision for the neighborhood. Her denial of reality only pushed the community further away. She wasn't just defying the law, she was refusing to acknowledge the will of the people around her. Her need for control had reached dangerous levels, and now, with the full weight of the law bearing down on her, she was starting to crack. Meanwhile, the parents felt a growing sense of hope. They had been fighting an uphill battle for so long, but now that the authorities were involved, it felt as though they were finally on the cusp of victory. They had gathered evidence, documented Karen's actions, and taken the necessary steps to ensure that she couldn't continue her harassment. But they knew that this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't someone who would quietly admit defeat. No, she would fight back, harder than ever. And the parents, knowing this, steeled themselves for what was to come. They had already made it through the worst of the fight, but Karen was only just getting started. As the investigation continued, the authorities were ready to take the next step. They had reviewed the evidence, and it was clear that Karen had crossed a line. It wasn't just about parking anymore, it was about her blatant abuse of power. The parents had been patient, but their patience was running thin. They weren't about to let Karen get away with this any longer, especially not when the stakes were so high. Finally, the authorities issued their first official ruling. Karen was served with a cease and desist order, demanding that she stop her campaign of harassment. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The neighborhood had made it clear that they would not allow one person's delusion of control to ruin their lives. But even with this ruling in place, Karen wasn't about to go down without a fight. Her sense of entitlement was deeply ingrained, and she wasn't about to let the law, or the people, dictate her actions. This, the parents knew, was far from over. The fight for their rights, and the neighborhood's peace, would continue. But they were stronger now, united in their resolve, and they weren't going to let Karen, or anyone, take that from them. Despite the cease and desist order, Karen's defiance only grew stronger. She wasn't the type to back down easily, and now that the authorities had made their decision, she felt even more cornered. Instead of accepting her loss, she decided to turn up the heat. It was as if she couldn't fathom the idea of being wrong or relinquishing control. She was determined to fight, not just with words, but with her every action. Karen's behavior became even more bizarre and erratic, each move more desperate than the last. She started showing up at the school during drop-off and pick-up times, staking out the parking area like a hawk. From the comfort of her own home, she watched the parade of cars, eyes narrowing at each one that dared to park near her house. Her presence was no longer a mere nuisance, it was a silent threat, a reminder that she still believed she was in charge. Every car that parked in front of her house felt like a challenge to her authority. The parents, now fully aware of her tactics, no longer flinched at her presence. They simply went about their business, dropping off their children and ignoring her cold, judgmental stares. But Karen wasn't done yet. She decided to take matters into her own hands again, this time leaving notes on the windshields of cars. Each note was more aggressive than the last, filled with hollow threats of legal action that had no real foundation. "You are trespassing on my private property. Expect legal consequences if you continue," one of the notes read. It was the same routine, another power play meant to strike fear into the parents. But this time, something had shifted. The parents were no longer afraid. They were wise to Karen's manipulative games and weren't backing down. A few of the parents, Emily in particular, had been documenting Karen's actions for weeks. She had already collected numerous pictures of the fake fines and her intimidating notes, but now she began recording video footage. One morning, as Karen marched out to place yet another note on a car, Emily captured it all. She even filmed Karen's threats, calmly stating that she would take the issue to the authorities if Karen continued. The footage was the final piece of evidence the parents needed to expose Karen for what she truly was, a bully with no real authority, preying on the neighborhood's fear. The video quickly went viral, spreading like wildfire across social media. The outrage was immediate, and the tide of public opinion turned decisively against Karen. What had once been a quiet suburban conflict was now a community-wide spectacle, and Karen was the villain in everyone's eyes. She had thought that by making herself the center of attention, she could regain control. Instead, she had created a public humiliation for herself, one that even she couldn't ignore. But instead of retreating, Karen doubled down. She posted more flyers around the neighborhood, attempting to rally what little support she could muster. "I'm just trying to protect my property," the flyers read, but they had lost their power. No one believed her anymore. The parents, who had once been divided and uncertain about how to deal with her, had now formed an unbreakable bond. They shared their experiences of Karen's harassment, and they shared the video of her latest threats. The community, once passive and resigned to Karen's manipulations, had now become a force that Karen couldn't control. In her desperation, Karen made one final, misguided move. She called the local media. She tried to spin her narrative, portraying herself as the victim, the misunderstood guardian of the neighborhood, and accusing the parents of overreacting. She even attempted to get local businesses involved once again, hoping to rally a few allies to her cause. But her plan backfired. The media coverage only amplified the parents' side of the story, and Karen's attempts to manipulate the narrative were met with even more ridicule. What Karen failed to understand was that the power she once held over the neighborhood was gone. The more she tried to manipulate the situation, the more isolated she became. Her actions only alienated those she had hoped to sway. No one was buying her story anymore. The parents, united and resolute, refused to let Karen's threats and bullying take away their peace. Instead of fear, Karen's actions now fueled their determination. She had underestimated the strength of their resolve, and with each failed attempt to regain control, her grip on the neighborhood slipped further away. Her reputation was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The parents had faced down her manipulation and come out stronger on the other side. What Karen had once seen as a way to enforce her will had become her undoing. Now, she was left to watch as the community she had tried to control moved on without her, stronger and more united than ever. Karen had made the fatal mistake of trying to break their spirit, but in doing so, she had only forged a stronger bond between them. And as she continued to dig herself deeper, the parents were ready to take the final steps to ensure she could no longer cause them any harm. The final confrontation came quickly, and it was a spectacle that no one had anticipated. The parents, now fully united, had had enough. They had already seen Karen's last attempts to manipulate the situation, but this time, they were ready to put an end to it once and for all. Armed with a powerful collection of evidence, including the viral video, photographs of her illegal fines, and testimonies from the entire neighborhood, they were poised to expose Karen for the bully she truly was. They weren't just fighting for their right to park on a public street anymore, they were fighting for their right to live peacefully, free from her harassment. As the final piece of the puzzle, the parents reached out to the local media. They knew that this wasn't just about Karen or her delusions of control. It was about standing up to anyone who tried to intimidate or manipulate others for their own benefit. The media coverage was swift and unforgiving, and the story spread far beyond the neighborhood. It wasn't long before the authorities, once again, took notice. With the overwhelming evidence against Karen, they had no choice but to intervene. The authorities issued one final warning, making it clear that if Karen didn't stop her illegal actions, there would be legal consequences. For the first time in months, Karen's once unshakable confidence began to waver. She refused to accept defeat, but the community had already turned the tide. Karen's isolation was complete. Her attempts to intimidate and control the neighborhood had failed spectacularly. The parents had stood together, and in doing so, they had reclaimed their power. The truth was out, and Karen was no longer able to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Her reign of terror had come to a crashing end, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. As the dust settled, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The streets were once again a place of peace and community, no longer controlled by one entitled individual. But as Karen retreated into the shadows of her home, one question remained: how many other communities are silently enduring similar battles? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA or Karen rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.